I woke up one cold morning in a sterile nursing home room, my fingers trembling, my wedding ring gone, the familiar weight of my purse nowhere to be found. They said I was safe now, but as I reached for my rights, my dignity, my voice, they vanished like smoke through my grasp. The woman staring back at me in that cracked mirror wasn't the mother who'd sacrificed everything for her family anymore. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Marie Catherine Sullivan, and for 73 years, I believed that love meant giving everything you had, even when there was nothing left to give. I lived in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on South Ashland Avenue in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood, where the scent of fresh tortillas from the panaderia downstairs would mix with the diesel fumes from the city buses that rumbled past my window every morning at 6:15 sharp. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, showing patches of the original mint green beneath, and my furniture, well, most of it came from garage sales and church donations over the years, but it was mine, or at least, I thought it was mine. Every morning, I'd wake up to the sound of construction workers speaking Spanish on their way to another high-rise going up in the neighborhood. The old Chicago I knew was changing, block by block, but my routine stayed the same. Coffee first. Always Maxwell House, never the expensive stuff. Then I'd sit at my small kitchen table with its wobbly leg that I'd propped up with a folded napkin years ago, and I'd check my phone, always hoping. Always waiting for that call from my son David. David Michael Sullivan, born on a snowy Tuesday in January of 1976, when I was 26 and still believed the world was full of promises waiting to be kept. He was 8 pounds, 2 ounces of pure possibility, with tiny fingers that would wrap around mine and hold on like he'd never let go. I used to tell him bedtime stories about brave knights and dragons, and he'd fall asleep against my chest while I hummed old Irish lullabies my mother had sung to me. When did he stop believing in those stories? When did I become the dragon in his life instead of the one fighting them for him? By the time David turned 47, our conversations had dwindled to monthly phone calls that felt more like business transactions than family connections. He'd call, usually on a Sunday afternoon when his wife Jennifer was at yoga and the kids were busy with their iPads, and he'd ask about my health in that distant, polite way people reserve for elderly relatives they're obligated to check on. How are you feeling, Mom? Are you taking your medications? Do you need anything from the store? But never. How are you, really? What's making you happy these days? Do you remember when we used to build blanket forts in the living room and pretend we were explorers discovering new continents? The conversations would last exactly 7 minutes and 32 seconds. I know because I timed them once, out of curiosity that later turned into heartbreak. 7 minutes and 32 seconds to summarize an entire month of my existence. 7 minutes to pretend we still had the kind of relationship where a son calls his mother because he misses her voice, not because his calendar reminded him it was time to fulfill his filial duty. That particular Thursday morning, I remember it was a Thursday because Mrs. Kowalski from 3B was taking her garbage out early, and she only did that on Thursdays. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee growing cold, staring at my phone. David had promised he'd come over for breakfast. Not just any breakfast, but the kind I used to make when he was little. Thick-cut bacon, eggs over easy with runny yolks, and toast buttered while it was still warm from the toaster. I'd gotten up at 5:30 to start preparing, not because it took 3 hours to make breakfast, but because I wanted everything to be perfect. I'd ironed the good tablecloth, the one with tiny blue flowers that I only used for special occasions, and I'd polished the silver butter dish that had been my mother's. I even drove to the Jewel Osco on Cermak Road the night before to buy real maple syrup. Not the corn syrup stuff I usually got, because I remembered David mentioning years ago that he preferred the real thing. 6:30 came and went. Then 7. By 8 o'clock, I was standing by the window, watching every car that turned down Ashland, hoping to see his silver BMW. 9 o'clock arrived with the morning rush hour, and I told myself he was just caught in traffic. By 10 o'clock, the bacon was cold and congealed in its own grease, and I was still standing there, still hoping, still making excuses for him in my mind. That's when I checked my phone and found the message. Not a phone call, Not even a text apologizing for being late. Just a brief, cold message sent at 11:43 the night before. Can't make it tomorrow. Something came up with Jenny's mom. Maybe next week. Something came up with Jenny's mom. Maybe next week. 49 years of being his mother, and I got the same consideration as a dentist appointment that could be rescheduled. I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by the perfect breakfast that no one would eat, wearing the good blouse I'd ironed the night before, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not yet, but crack, like ice on a pond in early spring, when you can see the fractures spreading beneath the surface but the whole thing hasn't collapsed yet. I threw the bacon away, all of it. The eggs went down the garbage disposal, shell and all, because I was shaking too hard to separate them properly. The toast went into the trash with such force that it bounced out and landed on the floor, where I left it because bending over to pick it up felt like more effort than I had left in my body. But I kept the tablecloth on the table. For 3 days, I ate my simple meals, crackers and cheese, canned soup, tea and toast, on that good tablecloth with the tiny blue flowers. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was hope, or maybe it was the last small rebellion of a woman who was tired of saving the good things for special occasions that never came. Do you know that feeling? When you realize you've been waiting your whole life for someone to treat you like you matter, and suddenly you understand that the waiting might never end? The photo on my refrigerator, the one held up by a magnet shaped like the Chicago skyline, showed David at age 5, gap-toothed and grinning, his small arms wrapped around my neck so tight I could barely breathe. He's wearing the red Superman cape I'd sewn for him out of an old bedsheet, and there's chocolate ice cream smeared across his cheek because I'd taken him to Navy Pier that day and let him have dessert before dinner. In that photo, I'm looking at him instead of the camera, and my expression is pure joy. Not the tired, careful smile I'd learned to wear in family photos as the years went by, but genuine, unguarded happiness. The kind of happiness that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. When did that little boy who couldn't bear to let go of me become a man who couldn't bear to spend 2 hours having breakfast with me? The answer, I realized as I stared at that photo, wasn't simple. It had happened gradually, over years and decades, through 1,000 small moments that I'd dismissed at the time as normal growing up. The first time he rolled his eyes when I reminded him to call when he got to his friend's house safely. The first time he said he was too old for bedtime stories. The first time he brought a girlfriend home and I could see him watching her reaction to our small apartment, our secondhand furniture, the way I pronounced certain words with the remnants of my own mother's Irish accent. David had grown up and moved on, the way children are supposed to do. But somewhere in that process, he'd also grown away from me. Not just physically, that was natural and healthy, but emotionally. I'd become an obligation instead of a relationship, a duty instead of a choice. And I'd let it happen. More than that, I'd encouraged it. Every time he canceled dinner, I said, "That's okay, sweetie. I understand." Every time he forgot my birthday, I called him instead, pretending I just wanted to chat. Every time he made it clear that spending time with his mother was somewhere near the bottom of his priority list, I made it easier for him by asking for less and less until I wasn't asking for anything at all. I was enabling my own heartbreak, and I didn't know how to stop. The next few years blurred together like scenes from a movie played at the wrong speed. David got promoted to regional manager at the insurance company where he worked. Jennifer quit her job at the marketing firm to stay home with their 2 children, Emma, who was 12 and had inherited David's stubborn streak, and Michael, who was 9 and loved dinosaurs with the kind of passion I remembered David having for superheroes at that age. I saw the children maybe 4 times a year: Easter, Emma's birthday, Michael's birthday, and Christmas. Sometimes David would bring them by when Jennifer was visiting her sister in Milwaukee, dropping them off for a few hours while he ran errands. I treasured those visits like precious gems, storing up every laugh, every hug, every moment of connection to sustain me through the long months in between. Emma was polite but distant, the way pre-teenagers are with adults they don't see very often. She'd sit on my couch, texting friends on her phone, occasionally looking up to make brief eye contact when I asked about school or her favorite subjects. But Michael still had that openness that younger children possess. He'd explore my apartment like it was a fascinating new territory, asking why I had so many books, why my television was so small, why I didn't have a dishwasher. "Grandma Marie," he said during one visit, a year and a half before everything fell apart, "do you get lonely living by yourself?" The question hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel. It wasn't. It was just honest curiosity from a child who lived in a house full of people and activity, but because of how desperately I wanted to answer truthfully. Yes, I wanted to tell him. Yes, I get so lonely sometimes that I talk to the television just to hear conversation in my apartment. Yes, I get so lonely that I go to the grocery store even when I don't need anything, just to have brief interactions with the cashier and bag boy. Yes, I get so lonely that I've memorized the schedules of my neighbors, so I know when to take out my garbage or check my mail, hoping to run into someone who might chat for a few minutes about the weather or the construction on 18th Street. Instead, I smiled and said, "Oh, I keep plenty busy, sweetheart." And Mrs. Garrity next door checks on me sometimes. Mrs. Garrity. Margaret Mary Garrity, 78 years old, originally from Oakland but living in Chicago for the past 15 years to be closer to her daughter's family. She had wild silver hair that she wore in a messy bun secured with whatever happened to be handy. Pencils, chopsticks. Once I'd even seen her use a small screwdriver. She'd moved into 2C about 3 years earlier, after her daughter convinced her that the Pilsen apartment was safer and more affordable than the studio she'd been renting in Lincoln Park. Margaret had been a social worker for 43 years before retiring, and she had the kind of direct, no-nonsense way of speaking that could cut through pretense like a hot knife through butter. She also had an uncanny ability to show up at my door with a cup of coffee or a plate of cookies at exactly the moments when I needed human contact most desperately. "Marie Catherine," she'd say. She was the only person who used my full first name. "You look like you could use some company. Mind if I come in?" I never minded. In fact, I lived for those unexpected visits, though I was too proud and too afraid of seeming needy to ever admit it out loud. During one of our coffee sessions, about 6 months before my world completely unraveled, Margaret had asked me a question that I couldn't stop thinking about afterward. "When was the last time your son did something for you just because he wanted to? Not because you asked or because it was expected?" I'd opened my mouth to answer immediately, ready with examples of David's thoughtfulness and care. But then I'd stopped, searching my memory for instances of unprompted kindness or consideration. Phone calls that weren't in response to messages I'd left. Visits that weren't tied to holidays or family obligations. Gifts that weren't birthday or Christmas presents, but just spontaneous gestures of affection. The silence stretched between us until Margaret nodded sadly. "That's what I thought," she said quietly. "He's busy," I defended. "He has a demanding job. And Jennifer. And the kids. His life is complicated. Everyone's life is complicated, Marie Catherine. The people who love you find time anyway." That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about Margaret's words. Around 3 in the morning, I got up and made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sitting at my kitchen table in the dim light from the street lamp outside. I thought about all the ways I'd justified David's distance over the years, all the excuses I'd made for him, not just to other people, but to myself. He was going through a difficult phase at work. Jennifer was dealing with postpartum depression after Michael was born. Emma was having trouble at school and needed extra attention. The mortgage payments were higher than they'd expected. Jennifer's mother was having health problems. David was considering changing careers. The kids were involved in so many activities that weekends were chaos. There was always something, always a reason why this wasn't a good time for him to prioritize his relationship with his mother. Always a crisis, or a commitment, or a complication that took precedence over the woman who'd given 47 years of her life to raising him, supporting him, and loving him unconditionally. But when I really examined those excuses in the harsh light of 3 in the morning honesty, I realized that they all had one thing in common. They positioned me as the optional relationship in David's life. The person who would understand and accommodate and wait patiently until things calmed down enough for him to spare me some attention. I was the last priority because I'd taught him that I would always be there, no matter how long he ignored me or how little effort he put into our relationship. I was the safe, guaranteed love that required no maintenance, no investment, no real consideration. And perhaps most painful of all, I was okay with that arrangement because I was so afraid of losing him completely that I'd rather have him in my life as an obligation than not have him at all. The realization should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like drowning. 2 months after that sleepless night, I had a minor heart episode. Not a full heart attack. The doctors at University of Illinois Hospital were very clear about that. But what they called cardiac events that required an overnight stay for observation and some adjustments to my medications. I'd been at home, making dinner, just scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, when I felt a tightness in my chest and a strange fluttering sensation that made me sit down hard on one of my kitchen chairs. The pain wasn't severe, more like pressure, but it was accompanied by a lightheadedness that frightened me enough to call 911. The paramedics were kind and professional, asking questions as they checked my vital signs and loaded me onto a stretcher. Had I been experiencing stress lately? Any unusual physical exertion? Changes in my routine or medications? Stress. I almost laughed, but the oxygen mask made that difficult. If stress could cause heart problems, I should have been dead years ago. At the hospital, they ran tests and kept me overnight in a room that smelled like disinfectant and fear. The cardiac monitor beeped steadily beside my bed, an electronic heartbeat that reminded me with every sound that my own heart might not be as reliable as I'd always assumed. From my hospital bed, I called David. It took him 3 hours to call me back. "Mom?" His voice was rushed, distracted. I could hear traffic in the background and what sounded like a conference call on speaker in his car. "I got your message. Are you okay?" "I'm in the hospital," I said quietly. "I had some chest pains, and they're keeping me overnight for observation." "Oh." A pause. The sound of a turn signal clicking. "Well, that's probably just precautionary, right? I mean, you're not having a heart attack or anything serious? The doctors say I'm stable, but that's good. That's really good, Mom. Listen, I'm actually on my way to a client meeting right now, but I'll try to stop by later if I can get away. If not, I'll definitely call you tonight to check in." He didn't stop by. The phone call that night lasted 4 minutes and consisted mainly of him asking if I needed him to bring me anything from home, which was thoughtful in theory, but missed the point entirely. I didn't need things from my apartment. I needed my son to sit beside my hospital bed and hold my hand and tell me that he was glad I was okay, that he'd been worried, that I mattered to him. Instead, I spent the evening alone, watching game shows on the tiny television mounted to the wall and listening to the sounds of other patients receiving visits from their families. The woman in the bed next to me, separated by a thin curtain, had a constant stream of visitors. Her daughter, 2 sons, several grandchildren, and what seemed like half of her church congregation. They brought flowers and balloons and homemade cookies, and they took turns sitting beside her bed, holding her hand and telling her stories about their day. I pretended to be asleep so I could listen to their conversations without feeling like an intruder. The daughter talked about her youngest son's soccer game. One of the sons described a funny incident at his job. The grandchildren showed their grandmother drawings they'd made for her and promised to take extra good care of her cat while she was in the hospital. It was the kind of family intimacy I'd dreamed of having with my own children and grandchildren. The easy, natural connection that comes from people who genuinely enjoy each other's company and prioritize their relationships, even when life gets complicated. When the doctor discharged me the next afternoon with instructions to reduce stress and follow up with my regular physician, David sent a text message asking if I needed help getting home. I told him I'd take a taxi, which was what I'd planned to do anyway. But part of me had hoped he might insist on picking me up. He didn't insist. He texted back, "Okay, sounds good. Glad you're feeling better." The taxi ride home through the streets of Chicago, past the Willis Tower gleaming in the afternoon sun, over the Chicago River with its painted green bridges, through neighborhoods where families were walking together and couples were holding hands, felt like a journey back to my real life. The life where I was alone with my thoughts and my fears and my growing understanding that the people I loved most in the world saw me as peripheral to their happiness. That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, but this time I wasn't making excuses for David or trying to rationalize his behavior. I was asking myself a different question. What would happen if I stopped being so understanding? What would happen if I started expecting more from the people who claimed to love me? The answer, I suspected, was that I'd find out how much I actually mattered to them, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that revelation. 3 months later, I found the letter that changed everything. I'd been cleaning out the small desk in my living room, the one where I kept important papers and old photographs. It was a task I'd been putting off for weeks, one of those tedious but necessary jobs that accumulate when you live alone and have no one to help with household maintenance. Among the bills and insurance papers and medical records, I found a thick manila envelope addressed to David at my address. The return address was from Morrison, Katz & Associates, a law firm downtown that I'd never heard of. The envelope was marked Urgent, Confidential, in red letters across the front. It had been delivered to my apartment by mistake. The address was correct, but the name was David's instead of mine. I should have forwarded it to his house immediately. That would have been the right thing to do, the respectful thing to do, the thing that would maintain the boundaries between his private business and my natural maternal curiosity. I held that envelope in my hands for 20 minutes, sitting on my couch in the afternoon light streaming through my living room windows. 20 minutes of internal debate about privacy and propriety and the delicate balance of respect between adult children and their aging parents. But then, I remembered lying in that hospital bed alone. I remembered the 4-minute phone call and the canceled breakfast and the 7-minute and 32-second monthly conversations that had become the extent of our relationship. I remembered feeling like such an insignificant part of my own son's life that news of my hospitalization had taken a back seat to a client meeting. I opened the envelope. The papers inside were complex and full of legal terminology that took me several readings to understand fully. But the basic facts were clear enough to make my hands shake and my coffee grow cold as I sat there, piecing together a betrayal I'd never seen coming. David had hired a law firm to help him gain power of attorney over my finances and medical decisions. The letter outlined a strategy for having me declared incompetent to manage my own affairs, based on what they called observable evidence of age-related cognitive decline and poor financial judgment. Observable evidence of cognitive decline. I read that phrase over and over, each time feeling like I'd been slapped. What evidence? I balanced my checkbook every month. I paid my bills on time. I took my medications correctly. I navigated the Chicago public transportation system, managed my own grocery shopping, maintained my apartment, and held coherent conversations with neighbors and friends. Poor financial judgment. What poor financial judgment? I lived within my means, saved what I could, and had enough money in certificates of deposit and savings accounts to maintain my independence for years to come. The only poor financial judgment I could think of was the money I'd given to David over the years, help with his college loans, a down payment contribution when he and Jennifer bought their house, the $5,000 I'd lent him when his company was going through layoffs and his job was uncertain. Money he'd never repaid, though he'd never explicitly said he wouldn't. It had just become one of those family financial arrangements that fade into the background of relationship history, neither acknowledged nor resolved. But the worst part, the detail that made me feel like I might vomit right there on my living room rug, was the reference to the client's existing will and the need for revision upon establishment of guardianship. My existing will, the will I'd written 12 years earlier, when David and Jennifer had first gotten married, and I'd wanted to ensure that my assets would be properly distributed to take care of my grandchildren's education and provide some security for the family I loved so much. In that will, I'd left everything to David, trusting him to use the money wisely and to honor my wishes about helping with Emma and Michael's college expenses and maintaining the small memorial fund I'd wanted to establish in my late husband's name. It was a simple will, but it represented everything I'd worked for and saved during my 73 years of life. The legal papers suggested that David planned to revise that will once he'd gained control over my affairs. Revise it how? To benefit whom? And most importantly, why was my own son working so hard to gain legal control over my life when I'd never given him any reason to believe I was incapable of managing my own affairs? I sat in my living room as the afternoon turned to evening, reading and rereading those legal documents, trying to make sense of a situation that felt like something from a nightmare. This was my son, the child I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, the man I'd trusted with my deepest hopes and fears, the person who, despite his recent distance and emotional unavailability, I'd still believed loved me in his own complicated way. But these papers painted a picture of a son who saw his aging mother not as a person deserving of respect and autonomy, but as an obstacle to be legally maneuvered around, a problem to be solved through court orders and declarations of incompetence. The phone rang while I was sitting there in the growing darkness, still holding the legal papers in my trembling hands. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I wondered if he somehow knew that I'd discovered his plan. Had the law firm told him that the papers had been delivered to the wrong address? "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded normal, casual, the same slightly distracted tone he always used when calling me. "Just checking in. How are you feeling? How are you feeling?" The question that used to seem like caring concern now sounded like intelligence gathering. Was he asking about my physical health to assess whether I might be declining enough to support his case for incompetency? Was he listening for signs of confusion or memory problems that his lawyers could use as evidence? "I'm fine," I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "How are you?" "Good, good. Busy as always. Jennifer's got me running around to soccer practices and piano recitals. You know how it is." "No," I thought. "I don't know how it is. You've never included me enough in your family's life for me to know how anything is. Listen, Mom, I was wondering if you've been keeping track of your medications lately. Jennifer mentioned that you seemed a little confused the last time she talked to you on the phone." Confused? I tried to remember the last phone conversation I'd had with Jennifer. It had been brief, maybe 5 minutes, and she'd called to ask if I wanted them to pick me up anything when they went to Costco. I'd thanked her, but said I didn't need anything from a warehouse store since I was just shopping for one person. The conversation had been perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, unless David and Jennifer were now interpreting my polite independence as confusion. "I'm managing my medications just fine," I said. "The same way I've been managing them for the past 15 years. I know. It's just that as we get older, sometimes these things become more challenging, and we don't always notice the changes ourselves, you know? As we get older." As if David, at 47, had any understanding of what it meant to be 73, and living alone in a world that increasingly seemed designed for younger people who moved faster and adapted more easily to constant change. "David," I said carefully, "is there something specific you're worried about?" A pause. "No, not worried exactly. Just, wanting to make sure you're taking care of yourself. Maybe we should set up a time to go over some things together. Your finances, your medical information, just to make sure everything is organized. Your finances, your medical information, just to make sure everything is organized." The legal papers were still in my lap, and I wondered if David could somehow sense that I knew about his plans. Was this phone call part of the strategy his lawyers had recommended? Plant seeds of doubt about my competency, then position himself as the caring son who just wanted to help his aging mother get organized. "I think my finances and medical information are perfectly organized," I said, "but thank you for your concern." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, well, if you change your mind or if you need help with anything, just let me know. I will. Love you, Mom. Love you, Mom." Words that should have warmed my heart and eased my fears. Instead, they sounded hollow, automatic, like something he said because it was expected rather than because he felt it. "Love you too," I replied, because what else could I say? After I hung up, I sat in my living room in complete darkness, not bothering to turn on the lamps. Outside my windows, Chicago continued its evening routine. People coming home from work, families gathering for dinner, the comfortable sounds of a neighborhood settling into night. But inside my apartment, I felt like I was sitting in the middle of an earthquake that only I could feel. Everything I'd believed about my relationship with my son, everything I'd trusted about his love and respect for me, had shifted beneath my feet. I was no longer a mother being cared for by her grown child. I was a mark being targeted by someone who saw my assets as his inheritance and my independence as an inconvenience to be eliminated. The realization was devastating, But it was also, in a strange way, clarifying. For years, I'd been making excuses for David's emotional distance, telling myself that he was just busy, that he showed love in different ways, that I needed to lower my expectations and be grateful for whatever attention he was willing to spare me. I'd convinced myself that his lack of interest in spending time with me was a normal part of adult children growing up and creating their own lives. But this wasn't about natural growing up. This was about a fundamental lack of respect for me as a person. David wasn't just too busy to call his mother regularly or visit more often. He was actively working to take away my right to make decisions about my own life, my own money, my own future. And he was doing it while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd known betrayal could cut. This wasn't a stranger trying to take advantage of an elderly woman. This was my own child, the person I'd loved more than my own life, treating me like an enemy to be defeated rather than a mother to be honored. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about all the ways David's recent behavior made sense in light of what I'd discovered. The questions about my medications weren't caring concern. They were evidence gathering. The suggestions that I might need help getting organized weren't offers of support. They were attempts to establish a pattern of incompetence. Even his distance and emotional unavailability served his purposes by allowing him to claim that I was isolated and potentially vulnerable. I'd been wondering when my loving little boy had become such a distant man. Now I knew. He hadn't just become distant. He'd become calculating. How long had he been planning this? Months? Years? Had he been talking to Jennifer about the best strategy for gaining control over my assets? Had they discussed my supposed cognitive decline over dinner, analyzing my behavior for signs they could use to support their legal case? Had my grandchildren been listening to their parents talk about Grandma Marie as if she was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved? The next morning, I called in sick to my volunteer work at the local food pantry, something I'd never done in the 3 years since I'd started volunteering there, and I spent the day researching everything I could about elder law, power of attorney, and guardianship proceedings in Illinois. What I learned terrified me. If David was successful in having me declared incompetent, I would lose the right to make decisions about where I lived, how I spent my money, what medical treatments I received, and who I could see or communicate with. He would become, legally and practically, my owner. I would be reduced to the status of a child. But unlike actual children, who gradually gain more rights and freedoms as they mature, I would only lose more autonomy as time went on. The standards for proving incompetence weren't as high as I'd hoped. David wouldn't need to show that I had severe dementia, or that I was completely unable to care for myself. He would just need to convince a judge that I had enough cognitive decline to make poor decisions about my finances or health care. And at 73, living alone, with no family members willing to testify on my behalf, I would be vulnerable in ways that someone with more social support would not be. Why hadn't anyone ever explained this to me? Why didn't they teach classes for seniors about how to protect themselves from their own adult children? Why was there so much information available about how to care for aging parents, but so little about how aging parents could maintain their independence and dignity when their children saw them as burdens? I spent that whole day reading articles and legal websites and forum posts from other elderly people who'd found themselves in similar situations. The stories were heartbreaking in their similarity. Adult children who'd grown impatient with their parents' autonomy, who'd convinced themselves that taking control was in their parents' best interests, who'd used the legal system to override their parents' wishes about their own lives. Some of the stories had happy endings. Parents who'd fought back successfully, families who'd worked through their conflicts and found better ways to navigate the challenges of aging. But many of the stories ended with elderly people living in nursing homes they hadn't chosen, having their personal belongings sold or distributed according to their children's preferences, dying without the dignity of making their own basic decisions. I didn't want that to be my story. That evening, Margaret knocked on my door with a plate of homemade cookies and her usual direct approach to conversation. "Marie Catherine," she said, settling herself on my couch with her coffee mug, "you look like someone who's been carrying the weight of the world today. What's going on?" I'd been debating all day whether to tell anyone about what I'd discovered. Part of me was embarrassed that my own son was treating me this way. Part of me was afraid that talking about it would make it more real, more threatening, and part of me worried that Margaret would think I was being paranoid or that I'd misunderstood the legal documents. But Margaret had been a social worker for 4 decades. She'd seen every kind of family dysfunction and abuse and manipulation. If anyone would understand what I was facing and take it seriously, it would be Margaret. I told her everything. About finding the legal papers, about David's phone calls that now seemed like evidence gathering, about my research into guardianship laws, and the terrifying realization that my own child was working to take away my fundamental rights as an adult human being. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression growing more and more grim as I spoke. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. "How much money are we talking about, Marie Catherine?" The question surprised me. "What do you mean?" "Your assets. The money David would inherit if something happened to you, or that he'd control if he got guardianship. How much are we talking about?" I thought about it. I'd never added up the total value of everything I owned, but between my savings accounts, the certificates of deposit I'd built up over years of careful money management, my small investment portfolio, and the equity in my apartment, it was probably somewhere around $400,000. Not a fortune by Chicago standards, but certainly enough money to make a significant difference in someone's life. "Maybe 400,000, I said. Margaret nodded grimly. "That's more than enough to motivate this kind of behavior. Marie Catherine, your son isn't trying to help you. He's trying to steal from you, legally, systematically, and with the blessing of the court system, but it's still theft." Hearing it stated so bluntly, so clearly, should have been shocking. Instead, it was almost a relief. For months, I'd been questioning my own perceptions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or too suspicious about David's behavior. But Margaret, with her years of professional experience and her outsider's perspective, was confirming what I'd been afraid to believe. "What should I do?" "First, you should secure all of your important documents and make sure David can't access your accounts or your legal papers. Then you should get your own lawyer, not someone he recommends, not someone you find through a referral he provides, but someone who works exclusively for you and who understands elder law. And then?" Margaret's smile was sharp and determined. "Then you fight back. You show your son that his mother isn't nearly as helpless as he thinks she is." That night, I removed all of my important papers from the small desk in my living room and put them in a safety deposit box at the bank branch on Cermak Road. My will, my financial records, my medical directives, my insurance policies, my Social Security documents, everything went into that metal box in the bank vault, where David couldn't access it even if he somehow gained entry to my apartment. It felt like a small act of rebellion, but it also felt like the first step toward reclaiming control over my own life. The next morning, I called Legal Aid of Chicago and explained my situation to a kind woman named Patricia, who specialized in helping seniors navigate family conflicts and protect their assets from exploitation. Patricia squeezed me into her schedule for that afternoon, and I took the bus downtown to meet with her in a small office near the courthouse. Patricia was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded me of Margaret. She listened to my story, reviewed copies of the legal documents I'd found, and asked me detailed questions about my mental and physical health, my financial management, and my relationship with David. "Mrs. Sullivan," she said when I'd finished explaining everything, "I want to be completely honest with you about what you're facing. Your son has hired a very expensive law firm that specializes in these kinds of guardianship proceedings. They're good at what they do, and they know how to present cases in ways that judges find compelling." My heart sank. "So there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that. But you need to understand that this is going to be a fight, and it's going to require you to be strong and strategic and probably more assertive than you've ever been with your son before. Are you prepared for that? Was I prepared to fight my own child in court? Was I prepared to stand up in front of a judge and argue that my son was lying about my mental competence because he wanted to steal my money? Was I prepared to potentially destroy whatever remained of my relationship with David and, by extension, my relationship with my grandchildren? The old Marie, the one who'd spent decades making excuses for David's behavior and prioritizing family harmony over her own needs, would have said no, would have found a way to convince herself that maybe David really was just concerned about her welfare, that maybe there was a misunderstanding, that maybe she should just go along with his plans because maintaining the relationship was more important than maintaining her independence. But the new Marie, the one who'd spent a day researching how elder guardianship could strip away every right she'd taken for granted, who'd realized that her son saw her as a problem to be legally eliminated rather than a mother to be loved, was ready for the fight. "Yes," I said. "I'm prepared." Patricia smiled for the first time during our meeting. "Good, because we're going to make this very difficult for them." Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia and I worked together to build a comprehensive case demonstrating my mental competence and ability to manage my own affairs. I underwent cognitive testing with a psychologist who specialized in geriatric assessments. I had my physician write a detailed letter about my physical and mental health. I gathered financial records showing years of responsible money management. I collected character references from neighbors, volunteer supervisors, and friends who could attest to my independence and decision-making abilities. Most importantly, Patricia helped me understand that I had rights, and that David's attempt to take those rights away from me wasn't motivated by love or concern, but by greed and impatience. Elder financial abuse often looks like caring from the outside, Patricia explained. Adult children who are concerned about their parents, who just want to make sure mom or dad is safe and well cared for. But when you look at the actual motivations and the actual outcomes, you see that it's really about control and money. During those 2 weeks, David called me 3 times. Each conversation felt like a chess match, with him probing for evidence of confusion or incompetence, and me carefully monitoring every word I said to avoid giving him anything he could use against me. "Mom, I was talking to Jennifer about maybe helping you set up some kind of system for managing your bills and medications," he said during the second call. "You know, just to make things easier for you." "My bills and medications are already managed perfectly well," I replied calmly. "But thank you for thinking of me. I know you think they are, but sometimes it's hard to see when we're struggling with things. There's no shame in accepting help. There's no shame in accepting help. But there would be shame in losing my autonomy because my son had convinced a judge that I was too confused to manage my own life." "David," I said, "I'm curious about something. Have you been thinking about this for a long time? Or is this a new concern?" A pause. "Thinking about what?" "About whether I'm capable of managing my own affairs." Another, longer pause. "I just think that as people get older, it's natural for their families to be more involved in making sure they're okay. More involved." That was one way to describe legal guardianship, I supposed. 3 days later, I received formal legal papers notifying me that David, through his attorneys, was petitioning the court to grant him guardianship over my person and my finances based on my alleged incapacity to manage my own affairs. The petition was filled with lies presented as concerns. I was isolated and increasingly confused. I had demonstrated poor judgment in financial matters. I was resistant to accepting help with basic tasks. I had shown signs of memory problems and decision-making difficulties that put me at risk. Reading those lies typed up on official legal letterhead, signed by lawyers and submitted to a court, was almost more devastating than the original betrayal. David wasn't just trying to take control of my life. He was willing to lie about me, to destroy my reputation and dignity, to portray me as a mentally declining old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own basic decisions. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks away. 3 weeks to prepare for the most important fight of my life. Patricia met with me twice more before the hearing, coaching me on how to present myself in court and what to expect from David's attorneys. They would try to make me seem confused or agitated. They would ask questions designed to trip me up or make me appear forgetful. They would present every instance of normal aging, occasional difficulty remembering names, needing reading glasses, moving a little more slowly than I used to, as evidence of incompetence. "Remember," Patricia told me, "competency isn't about being perfect. It's about being able to understand information and make reasoned decisions. You don't have to have the memory of a 20-year-old or the physical abilities you had in middle age. You just have to show that you're capable of managing your own life." The night before the hearing, I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, looking through old photo albums. Pictures of David as a baby, as a toddler, as a school-aged child. Pictures of the two of us at his high school graduation, his college graduation, his wedding. Pictures of holidays and birthdays and ordinary Sunday afternoons when we'd just enjoyed each other's company. In every photo, I looked like a woman who loved her son more than life itself. And in the photos where David was old enough to express emotions clearly, he looked like a child who loved his mother back. When had that love become conditional on my silence and compliance? When had I become someone to be managed rather than someone to be cherished? I closed the photo albums and put them away. Tomorrow, I would go to court and fight for the right to remain the author of my own life story. I would face my son across a courtroom and tell a judge that his mother was not the failing, incompetent old woman he was claiming she was. I would fight for my dignity, my independence, and my future. And I would win, because the alternative, spending whatever years I had left as a legal child controlled by someone who saw me as an obstacle to his inheritance, was unacceptable. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. I arrived early with Patricia, wearing my best navy blue dress and the pearl necklace my late husband had given me for our 25th wedding anniversary. I wanted to look competent and dignified, like someone who clearly possessed the mental faculties to manage her own affairs. David was already there with his lawyers, sitting at a table across from where Patricia and I would sit. He was wearing a dark suit and a serious expression, and when he glanced over at me, his face showed what might have been regret or guilt or just nervousness about what was about to happen. For a moment, seeing him there, I felt a familiar urge to make this easier for him, to stand up and tell the judge that maybe my son was right, that maybe I did need help managing things, that maybe it would be better for everyone if David just took care of everything. The old Marie, the one who'd spent decades prioritizing David's comfort over her own needs, whispered that this conflict was tearing the family apart, and that a good mother would sacrifice her own autonomy to preserve family harmony. But then I remembered the lies in his legal petition. I remembered the months of evidence gathering disguised as caring phone calls. I remembered that he'd been willing to have me declared mentally incompetent, rather than simply talking to me about his concerns, like an adult talking to another adult. This wasn't about my welfare. This was about controlling me, and I was not going to cooperate with my own subjugation. The judge was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and a direct manner of speaking. She reviewed the case files quickly, then looked up at David's lawyer. "Counselor, please present your case for why Mrs. Sullivan requires guardianship." David's lead attorney, a man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd never had a conversation with anyone over 65 unless they were paying him, stood and began outlining his arguments. Mrs. Sullivan was isolated and had few social contacts. She was living alone in a neighborhood that was becoming increasingly unsafe for elderly people. She had been resistant to accepting help from her family. There were concerns about her memory and decision-making abilities. He called David to testify. My son walked to the witness stand, placed his hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then he began describing his concerns about my mental and physical decline, speaking in the caring, worried tone of a devoted son who only wanted what was best for his aging mother. "I've noticed that Mom seems confused more often lately," he said. "She'll repeat herself in conversations, or forget that we've already discussed something. She's fallen a few times, but she doesn't want to admit that she might need help getting around safely." I'd fallen a few times? I tried to remember when I might have fallen. There was the time last winter when I'd slipped on some ice outside my apartment building, but I'd caught myself and hadn't been hurt. There was the time I'd tripped over the edge of a rug in my living room, but again, no injury. Just a moment of clumsiness that could happen to anyone at any age. David was turning normal, minor incidents into evidence of dangerous physical decline. "She's also become very secretive about her finances," he continued. "She won't discuss her accounts with me or let me help her organize her important papers. This is new behavior for her, and it worries me. Secretive about her finances. I'd put my important papers in a safety deposit box to prevent him from accessing them without my permission, which was exactly what any reasonable person would do if they discovered that someone was trying to gain legal control over their assets. I love my mother very much, David concluded, and I just want to make sure she's safe and properly cared for. I don't think she realizes how much her abilities have declined, and I'm worried that without some help, she might make decisions that could put her at risk. David's lawyer called one more witness, Jennifer, who testified about a phone conversation we'd had where I'd seemed confused about what day it was and had repeated myself several times. She spoke about her concerns for my welfare and her belief that David would make a caring and responsible guardian. Jennifer had always been polite to me but distant, and I'd assumed that was just her personality. Now I realized that she'd been evaluating me, looking for signs of decline that could support their legal case. Our few interactions hadn't been attempts to build a closer relationship with her mother-in-law. They'd been intelligence gathering. Then it was Patricia's turn to present my case. She called me to the witness stand first. I walked carefully but confidently to the front of the courtroom, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Then I began explaining to the judge why I was perfectly capable of managing my own life. Your Honor, I've been living independently for the past 8 years since my husband died. I manage my own household, my own finances, my own medical care, and my own social activities. I volunteer regularly at a local food pantry. I maintain friendships with neighbors and other members of my community. I take public transportation throughout Chicago. I vote in every election, and I've never missed paying a bill or taking my medications. The judge asked me about the specific concerns David had raised. The falling incidents, which I explained had been minor and infrequent. The repetitive conversations, which I said I couldn't recall, but which could happen to anyone when discussing complex or important topics. The secrecy about my finances, which I explained was actually a reasonable response to discovering that my son was trying to gain control over my assets without my consent. Mrs. Sullivan, the judge said, how do you feel about your son's petition for guardianship? Your Honor, I believe my son is motivated by his desire to inherit my assets, rather than by genuine concern for my welfare. I've never been declared incompetent by any medical professional. I've never been hospitalized for memory problems or cognitive decline. I've never been unable to care for myself or make reasonable decisions about my life. This petition is not in my best interests, and I respectfully ask that you deny it. Patricia called several witnesses on my behalf. My primary care physician testified that I was in good health for my age and showed no signs of dementia or serious cognitive impairment. The volunteer coordinator from the food pantry described my reliable participation and good judgment in working with clients and handling responsibilities. Margaret testified about my independence and mental acuity, describing me as someone who was fully capable of making her own decisions and managing her own affairs. Most importantly, Patricia introduced the results of the comprehensive cognitive testing I'd undergone, which showed that my mental abilities were well within normal ranges for someone my age. Your Honor, Patricia said in her closing argument, this is not a case of a family trying to protect a vulnerable elder who lacks the capacity to make decisions. This is a case of an adult child who has grown impatient with his mother's independence and who sees guardianship as a way to gain control over her assets. Mrs. Sullivan is competent, independent, and capable of managing her own affairs. She has the right to make her own decisions about her life, her finances, and her future, even if those decisions are different from what her son would prefer. David's lawyer made one final argument about the importance of family involvement in elder care and the need to prevent elderly people from making decisions that might not be in their best interests. Then the judge made her decision. Based on the evidence presented, I find that Mrs. Sullivan is competent to manage her own affairs and that guardianship is not warranted at this time. The petition is denied. I felt like I could breathe for the first time in weeks. Patricia squeezed my hand under the table. Across the courtroom, David's face showed surprise and something that might have been anger. But the victory came with a cost. As we left the courtroom, David approached me in the hallway, his expression hurt and defensive. Mom, I can't believe you fought this. I was trying to help you. No, David, I said quietly. You were trying to control me. And you were willing to lie about my mental competence to do it. I wasn't lying. I'm genuinely concerned about you. You were genuinely concerned about inheriting my money. There's a difference. He stared at me for a moment, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. The realization that his mother was not the compliant, easily managed woman he'd thought she was. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yes, it is," I replied. "It's completely over." Walking out of that courthouse, I felt like a different person than the woman who'd walked in 3 hours earlier. I'd faced my own son in a legal battle and won. I'd defended my right to remain the author of my own life story. I'd refused to be diminished or controlled or reduced to someone else's idea of what an elderly woman should be. But I'd also ended my relationship with my son and, by extension, with my grandchildren. The price of maintaining my independence had been losing the family connections I'd treasured more than anything else in the world. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, thinking about the strange mathematics of love and dignity. Was it possible to have both? Could you maintain your self-respect and also keep the relationships with people who didn't respect you? I was about to find out. The weeks following the court hearing were quiet in a way that felt both peaceful and lonely. David didn't call. Jennifer didn't text. I heard nothing from Emma or Michael, and I assumed their parents had explained the situation in whatever way made David and Jennifer seem like the reasonable ones, and me seem like the difficult, stubborn grandmother who'd chosen legal battles over family harmony. I resumed my regular routines, volunteering at the food pantry, grocery shopping at the Jewel on Kermack, taking walks through my neighborhood when the weather was nice. On the surface, my life looked the same as it had before this whole nightmare began, but internally, everything had changed. I no longer spent my days waiting for phone calls that might not come, or hoping for visits that might be canceled. I no longer crafted careful conversations designed to avoid saying anything that might annoy David, or give him reasons to find me burdensome. I no longer second-guessed my own decisions, or wondered if I was asking too much by wanting basic consideration and respect from my own family. Instead, I started living for myself in ways I hadn't done in decades. I signed up for a painting class at the community center in Logan Square, something I'd been interested in for years, but had never prioritized because I was always saving my time and energy for family obligations that rarely materialized. The instructor, a woman in her 60s named Carmen who'd been an art teacher for 30 years before retiring, helped me discover that I had a decent eye for color and composition. "You've got natural instincts for this," she told me after I'd completed my third landscape painting. "Have you ever painted before?" "Not since high school," I said. "I always wanted to try again, but I never seemed to have the time." "Well, you've got time now, and talent. Don't waste either one." I didn't waste them. I set up a small easel in the corner of my living room, near the window where the afternoon light was best, and I painted whenever I felt like it. Landscapes of Chicago neighborhoods, still lifes of fruit and flowers from the farmer's market, abstract compositions and colors that made me feel calm or energized or contemplative. Margaret often stopped by to see my latest work, offering encouragement and sometimes sitting with me while I painted, both of us comfortable with the easy silence of friendship that doesn't require constant conversation. "You seem different," she said one afternoon, watching me work on a painting of the view from my kitchen window. "Lighter, somehow." "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel like I'm living my own life instead of waiting for permission to live it." "That's exactly what you're doing, and it suits you." 2 months after the court hearing, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable for the old Marie. I rearranged my living room furniture entirely according to my own preferences instead of the way it had been arranged since my husband died 12 years earlier. I moved the couch to face the windows instead of the television. I relocated the bookshelves to create a reading nook in the corner. I hung my paintings on the walls, replacing the formal family photos that had made me feel sad every time I looked at them. The result was a space that felt like mine, decorated for a woman who read books and created art, and enjoyed looking out at the world instead of passively watching it on a screen. I also, after much internal debate, updated my will. The original will had left everything to David, with the assumption that he would use the money responsibly and honor my wishes about helping with the grandchildren's education and maintaining a memorial fund in my husband's name. But David's actions had made it clear that he saw my assets as his future inheritance rather than my current resources, and that he was willing to take extreme measures to gain control over that inheritance before I was actually dead. Patricia helped me draft a new will that reflected my current priorities and relationships. I left modest amounts to Emma and Michael for their education, funds that would be placed in trusts they could access when they turned 21. I left a significant portion to the food pantry where I volunteered, knowing that the money would be used to help families in my neighborhood who were struggling with poverty and food insecurity. I left a smaller amount to Margaret, along with some of my personal belongings that I knew she would appreciate. And I left nothing to David. "Are you sure about this?" Patricia asked when I made this decision. "It's a dramatic change from your original will." I thought about David sitting in that courtroom, testifying under oath that his mother was confused and incompetent, willing to destroy my reputation and dignity to gain control over my money. I thought about the phone calls that had been evidence gathering instead of expressions of concern. I thought about the years of emotional distance and the casual dismissal of my needs and feelings. "I'm sure," I said. "David made it clear that he sees me as an obstacle to his inheritance rather than his mother. I don't want to reward that attitude." Signing that new will felt like closing a chapter of my life that had been defined by hope and disappointment. I was giving up on the dream of having the kind of family relationship where love was freely given and gratefully received. But I was also freeing myself from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from someone who'd already decided that I wasn't worth the effort. It was a trade-off, but it was a trade-off that gave me back my self-respect. Spring arrived early that year, and I celebrated by taking longer walks through neighborhoods I'd never explored before. Chicago in springtime is beautiful in ways that people who only visit in summer or winter never get to see. The trees along the lakefront path were just beginning to bud, and there were crocuses pushing up through the soil in Grant Park. The whole city felt like it was waking up after a long sleep. I felt like I was waking up too. One afternoon in April, I was walking through Lincoln Park when I saw a familiar small figure on the playground. Michael, my grandson, playing on the swings while Jennifer sat on a nearby bench, scrolling through her phone. For a moment, I considered walking in a different direction to avoid what would certainly be an awkward encounter. But then Michael saw me and waved, and I found myself walking over to say hello. "Grandma Marie!" He jumped off the swing and ran over to hug me, with the unreserved affection that 9-year-old children show when they haven't been taught to be cautious about their emotions. "I haven't seen you in forever." "Hello, sweetheart," I said, hugging him back and enjoying the feeling of small arms wrapped around my waist. "You've gotten taller since the last time I saw you. Dad says I grew 3 inches since Christmas. Are you still living in the same apartment?" "I am." "Are you still interested in dinosaurs?" "Yes, I'm reading a book about pterodactyls. Did you know they weren't actually dinosaurs? They were flying reptiles, but they lived at the same time as dinosaurs." I glanced over at Jennifer, who had looked up from her phone and was watching our interaction with an expression I couldn't read. She didn't look angry exactly, but she didn't look pleased either. "Michael, come back to the swings," she called. "We need to go home soon. Can Grandma Marie come with us?" he asked innocently. "Not today, honey. Maybe another time. Maybe another time." The polite dismissal that meant never. I knelt down to Michael's level and looked into his bright, curious eyes, so much like David's had been at that age. "Michael, I want you to know that I love you very much, and I'm proud of what a smart, kind boy you are. Even if I don't see you very often, I think about you all the time." He hugged me again, and I memorized the feeling of his small body against mine, knowing it might be the last time. "I love you too, Grandma Marie. Will you come to my birthday party in June?" I looked over at Jennifer, who was shaking her head slightly. "We'll see, sweetheart. But whether I'm at your party or not, I'll be thinking about you and wishing you the happiest of birthdays." Walking away from that playground, I cried for the first time since the court hearing. Not the desperate, hopeless crying I'd done when I first discovered David's plans, but a quieter, sadder grief for relationships that might have been beautiful if the people involved had made different choices. I missed my grandchildren. I missed the idea of family gatherings where everyone was genuinely happy to see each other. I missed believing that the people I loved the most in the world also loved me back in ways that translated into kindness and consideration and effort. But I didn't miss the anxiety of never knowing where I stood with David. I didn't miss the constant disappointment of having my expectations lowered again and again. I didn't miss feeling like I had to earn love that should have been freely given. That night, Margaret came over for dinner, something we'd started doing once or twice a week, taking turns cooking for each other and sharing quiet conversation about our days, our past experiences, our thoughts about books we'd read, or news stories we'd heard. "You seem sad tonight," she observed as we cleared the dinner dishes from my small table. I told her about the encounter with Michael at the playground, about the complicated mixture of joy and grief I'd felt seeing my grandson, and being reminded of what I'd lost when I chose to defend my independence instead of accepting David's control. "Do you regret fighting the guardianship case?" Margaret asked. I thought about it carefully before answering. No, I regret that it came to that. I regret that David saw me as someone to be managed instead of someone to be loved. I regret that he was willing to lie about my competence to get what he wanted, but I don't regret refusing to cooperate with my own diminishment. "That's the right answer," Margaret said firmly. "Family relationships that require you to give up your dignity aren't worth maintaining, even if it means losing my grandchildren." "Marie Catherine, you didn't lose your grandchildren because you stood up for yourself. You lost them because their father chose to use them as weapons in a conflict he started. That's on him, not you." Margaret was right, but that didn't make the loss any easier to bear. Summer came with its usual intensity in Chicago. Hot, humid days when the air conditioning in my old apartment building struggled to keep up, and warm evenings when I could sit by my open windows and listen to the sounds of families in the courtyard below. Children playing, parents calling them in for dinner, teenagers talking and laughing on the front steps. I watched these scenes of ordinary family life with a mixture of longing and acceptance. I would probably never have that kind of easy, natural connection with my own nuclear family. But I was building something else. A life that belonged entirely to me, filled with activities and relationships that I'd chosen rather than inherited. My painting had improved dramatically over the months of regular practice, and Carmen suggested that I consider entering some pieces in a community art show that would be held in the fall. The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. I'd never thought of myself as someone who created art worth showing to other people. But when I looked at the paintings covering the walls of my living room, landscapes and still lifes and abstracts that captured moments of beauty I'd noticed in my daily life, I felt proud of what I'd accomplished. "These are really good, Marie Catherine," Margaret said one evening, studying my latest painting, a street scene from Pilsen that showed the Mexican grocery store, the panaderia, and the elderly man who sold newspapers on the corner every morning. "You've captured something real here, something that matters. Do you think I should enter the art show?" "I think you should do whatever makes you feel most alive." What made me feel most alive, I realized, was creating things and choosing how to spend my time and energy instead of waiting for other people to decide whether I was worth their attention. I entered 3 paintings in the community art show. In August, I received an unexpected piece of mail that almost derailed my newfound peace. A letter from Emma, my granddaughter, now 13, and apparently able to access the postal system without her parents' knowledge. "Dear Grandma Marie," the letter began in the round, careful handwriting of a teenager who'd been taught to use cursive, but probably preferred texting. "I don't understand what happened between you and Dad, but I know you haven't been coming to family stuff anymore and Dad won't talk about it. Michael asks about you all the time and gets sad when Mom and Dad change the subject. I miss you. I know I wasn't very good at talking to you when I was younger, but I always liked that you listened to me and didn't treat me like I was just a little kid. Now that I'm older, I realize that most adults don't really pay attention to what kids are saying, but you always did. I hope you're okay, and I hope whatever happened with Dad can get fixed, because family is supposed to be forever, right? Love, Emma P.S. I'm learning to play guitar, and I'm pretty good at it. I wish I could play something for you." I read that letter 5 times, crying a little more with each reading. Emma was trying to bridge a gap that her father had created, reaching out with the kind of innocent hope that still believed family conflicts could be resolved with enough love and good intentions. I wanted to write back immediately, to tell her how much her letter meant to me, and how proud I was of the thoughtful young woman she was becoming. But I also knew that any response from me would likely cause problems for Emma with her parents, David and Jennifer had made it clear that I was no longer welcome in their lives, and they probably wouldn't appreciate their daughter maintaining an independent relationship with me. After much internal debate, I wrote a careful reply. Dear Emma, your letter made me happier than I can express. It means the world to me to know that you were thinking of me and that you cared enough to write. I miss you and Michael more than words can say. The situation between your father and me is complicated, and I don't want to put you in the middle of adult conflicts that aren't your responsibility to fix. But I want you to know that nothing that has happened between your father and me has anything to do with how much I love you and your brother. I'm proud of you for learning guitar. Music is one of the most beautiful things people can create, and I hope it brings you joy for your whole life. Please give Michael a hug from me and tell him that his Grandma Marie thinks about him every day. All my love, Grandma Marie P.S. If you ever want to write to me again, I would love to hear from you, but only do it if it won't cause problems for you at home. I mailed the letter with a return address but no phone number, giving Emma the option to continue corresponding if she chose to, but not pressuring her, or making it easy for her parents to contact me if they disapproved. 3 weeks later, I received another letter from Emma, this one longer and more detailed, telling me about starting high school, her guitar lessons, a book she'd read that she thought I might like, and questions about what my life was like now that she was old enough to be curious about adults as real people rather than just authority figures. We began a correspondence that continued throughout the fall, letters between a grandmother and granddaughter who were getting to know each other as individuals, separate from the family drama that had made our previous interactions stilted and infrequent. Through Emma's letters, I learned that Michael was doing well in school, that he'd moved on from dinosaurs to becoming fascinated with astronomy, and that he often asked when he would see me again. I learned that David and Jennifer were considering moving to a larger house in the suburbs, that David had been promoted again at work, and that the family was planning a trip to Disney World for Christmas vacation. The letters were a lifeline to the grandchildren I'd lost, but they also highlighted how much of their lives I'd missed and would continue to miss. I was grateful for Emma's thoughtfulness in writing to me, but I also knew that occasional letters could never replace the kind of ongoing relationship that grandparents typically have with their grandchildren. It was another loss to grieve, another dream to let go of. The community art show opened on a Saturday afternoon in October, in a converted warehouse space in Logan Square that had been decorated with white walls and professional lighting to showcase the work of local artists. I'd never attended an art opening before, and I wasn't sure what to expect or how to behave. Carmen had helped me frame my 3 paintings and had coached me on how to talk about my work if people asked questions. Just be honest about what inspired you to paint these scenes, she'd said. People respond to authenticity. Margaret came with me for moral support, wearing a bright red dress that made her look like the kind of confident, artistic woman I aspired to become. We walked through the gallery, looking at paintings and sculptures and photography from dozens of local artists, many of whom were seniors like me who'd discovered or rediscovered their creative abilities later in life. My paintings were grouped together on one wall, the street scene from Pilsen, a landscape of Lake Michigan on a stormy day, and an abstract piece in blues and greens that I'd painted during a particularly peaceful afternoon in my apartment. Small placards next to each piece listed the title, the artist's name, and the price, because apparently some of the work was for sale. I hadn't expected anyone to want to buy my paintings, but Carmen had convinced me to set modest prices just in case. You never know, she'd said. People collect art from community shows, especially when the work shows real skill and personal voice. Personal voice. I liked that phrase. After decades of subordinating my own voice to other people's preferences and expectations, I was finally learning what my own voice sounded like when I expressed it through color and brushstrokes. About an hour into the opening, a woman approached me while I was standing near my paintings, trying to look casual rather than anxiously watching people's reactions to my work. "Are you Marie Sullivan?" she asked. "The artist?" "I am," I said, still not entirely comfortable thinking of myself as an artist. "These are lovely. I'm particularly drawn to the street scene. There's something so warm and authentic about it. You've captured the real life of the neighborhood, not just the picturesque aspects." "Thank you. I live in that neighborhood." so I see these scenes every day. I wanted to paint something that felt true to the experience of actually living there. That definitely comes through in the work. Are you a new artist? Or have you been painting for a long time? I explained that I'd recently returned to painting after decades away from it, and that these were among the first pieces I'd completed since taking up the hobby again. Well, you have a natural eye for it. I hope you keep developing your skills. This kind of authentic, observational work is valuable. She bought the street scene painting. Standing there, watching a stranger write a check for something I'd created with my own hands and imagination, I felt a surge of pride and accomplishment unlike anything I'd experienced in years. Someone who didn't know me, who had no obligation to be polite or encouraging, had looked at my work and found it worthy of taking home and living with. I was an artist. Maybe not a professional artist, maybe not someone who would ever make a living from painting, but someone who created things that other people found meaningful and beautiful. By the end of the evening, I'd sold 2 of my 3 paintings and had several people ask if I planned to show work again in the future. Margaret beamed with pride as if my success was her own, and Carmen invited me to consider taking a more advanced painting class in the spring. Walking home through the Logan Square neighborhood that night, carrying the unsold abstract painting under my arm and a small envelope of money from my sales in my purse, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: the satisfaction of being recognized for my own accomplishments, independent of my relationships with other people. I wasn't just David's mother or Emma and Michael's grandmother. I wasn't just the widow of my late husband or the volunteer at the food pantry. I was Marie Sullivan, artist. A woman who created beautiful things and whose perspective on the world was valuable enough that strangers would pay to take it home with them. When I got back to my apartment, I hung the unsold painting in my bedroom, where I would see it first thing every morning and last thing every night. A reminder that I was more than the roles other people had assigned to me, more than the disappointments and losses that had shaped my life for so many years. I was someone who made art, someone who saw beauty in ordinary moments, and had the skill to translate that vision into something tangible and lasting. That winter was the most peaceful I'd experienced in decades. I painted regularly, took long walks through Chicago neighborhoods I'd never explored before, read books I chose based on my own interests, rather than recommendations from people who thought they knew what I should enjoy. I developed friendships with other people from my painting class, forming a small social circle of retired and semi-retired individuals who met regularly for coffee, museum visits, and conversations that ranged from current events to philosophy to favorite memories from our younger years. I also maintained my correspondence with Emma, whose letters had become more frequent and more personal as she grew more comfortable sharing her thoughts and experiences with me. Through her eyes, I got glimpses of David and Jennifer's life, the new house they'd bought in Naperville, David's latest promotion, family trips and weekend activities, without having to navigate the emotional complexity of direct contact with them. Emma was also becoming a more thoughtful and empathetic young person, asking questions about my life that showed genuine curiosity about who I was as an individual. She wanted to know about my painting, my memories of her grandfather, my thoughts about books and movies and current events. She was relating to me as a person, not just as a grandmother, and I treasured that evolving connection. In February, Emma's letters mentioned that Michael had been asking more frequently about why I didn't visit anymore, and that David had finally told both children that I'd chosen not to be part of the family anymore, because I didn't approve of some decisions their parents had made. David's version of events cast me as the unreasonable one, the grandmother who'd abandoned her grandchildren over minor disagreements with their parents. It was a narrative that protected David and Jennifer from having to explain their attempts to control my life and finances, but it also positioned me as the villain in my grandchildren's understanding of our family history. I wrote back to Emma with a careful explanation that adult family conflicts were often more complicated than they appeared on the surface, and that I hoped she would keep an open mind about all the people involved, rather than assuming that anyone was entirely right or entirely wrong. I didn't want to undermine her relationship with her parents, but I also didn't want her to grow up believing that I'd simply walked away from people I loved for trivial reasons. The most important thing, I wrote, is that my love for you and Michael has never changed, regardless of what other relationships in our family look like right now. Spring arrived again, and with it came an unexpected opportunity. Carmen, my painting instructor, was organizing an art trip to Santa Fe, New Mexico, for some of her more advanced students. 2 weeks of painting in a landscape completely different from Chicago, working with professional instruction and staying in a small bed and breakfast that catered to artists. The old Marie would have dismissed the idea immediately. Too expensive, too far from home, too self-indulgent for a woman her age. What if something happened to her health while she was traveling? What if David or the grandchildren needed her for something? But the new Marie, the one who'd learned that her own life was worth investing in, signed up immediately. I used some of the money from my art sales to pay for the trip, and I spent weeks beforehand researching Santa Fe, buying supplies, and imagining what it would be like to paint in the high desert landscape of New Mexico. The trip was everything I'd hoped it would be and more. The light in Santa Fe was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, clear and bright and somehow more intense than the light in Chicago. The colors of the landscape were subtle but complex. Dozens of shades of brown and gold and rust red, punctuated by the deep green of pinon pines and the brilliant blue of the high-altitude sky. I painted every day, sometimes for 6 or 7 hours, completely absorbed in the process of trying to capture the unique beauty of that place. My fellow travelers were a mix of ages and skill levels, but we were all united by our passion for creating art and our appreciation for the opportunity to focus entirely on painting without the distractions of daily life at home. In the evenings, we would gather to share the day's work, offering gentle critiques and encouragement to each other. I showed paintings I'd never have had the confidence to display in Chicago. Experimental pieces where I'd tried to capture the feeling of desert silence, bold compositions where I'd used colors that felt true to the emotional impact of the landscape rather than its literal appearance. "You've really found your voice as an artist," Carmen told me after looking at a painting I'd done of a thunderstorm moving across the desert. "There's a confidence in this work that wasn't there when you first started taking classes." Confidence. That was exactly what I'd found, not just in my painting, but in my life. The confidence to make decisions based on my own preferences and values rather than other people's expectations. The confidence to invest time and money in activities that brought me joy, even if those activities seemed frivolous to people who thought elderly women should limit their interests to practical caretaking activities. The confidence to see myself as someone whose perspective on the world was valuable and worth expressing. On the last day of the trip, I painted a self-portrait, something I'd never attempted before. Not a literal representation of my physical appearance, but an abstract composition that tried to capture who I was at this stage of my life. A woman who'd survived loss and betrayal and had emerged stronger, more independent, and more creative than she'd ever been before. The painting was predominantly in warm colors, golds and oranges and deep reds, but with touches of blue and green that suggested growth and possibility. Looking at it, I saw someone who'd learned to bloom in unexpected seasons of life. I brought that self-portrait home to Chicago and hung it in my living room, where it served as a daily reminder of who I'd become and who I was still becoming. Summer brought another letter from Emma, this one with news that made my heart ache. David and Jennifer were getting divorced. Emma's letter was confused and sad, written by a 14-year-old who was trying to make sense of her parents' decision to end their marriage and the ways that decision would change her life and Michael's. She wrote about custody schedules and therapy sessions and the strange experience of watching her parents, who'd seemed like a permanent unit her entire life, become separate people with separate households and separate futures. "I keep thinking that maybe if our whole family was together, this wouldn't have happened," she wrote. "Like maybe Dad has been stressed about the thing with you, and maybe that made everything else harder for him and Mom." The letter broke my heart on multiple levels. Emma was blaming herself and our family estrangement for her parents' marital problems, carrying guilt that belonged to the adults who'd made choices she'd had nothing to do with. She was also holding on to hope that somehow fixing the relationship between David and me could restore her sense of family stability and security. I wrote back immediately with the strongest, clearest message I could construct about the reality of adult relationships and the importance of not taking responsibility for other people's choices. "Emma," I wrote, "your parents' marriage has nothing to do with you or with Michael, or with the situation between your father and me. Adults make decisions about their relationships based on their own feelings and priorities, and children are never responsible for those decisions. Please don't carry guilt about something that is entirely between your mother and father. I also included my phone number in that letter, something I'd been hesitant to do before, but which felt necessary given the upheaval Emma was experiencing. If you ever need to talk to someone outside of your immediate family situation, I wrote, please know that you can call me. Day or night, if you need a safe person to listen to you, I'm here. Emma called me 2 weeks later, crying so hard it took me several minutes to understand what she was saying. David had moved out of the house. There would be a custody schedule that meant she and Michael would split their time between 2 homes. Jennifer was talking about getting a job since she wouldn't have David's income to rely on entirely. Michael was acting out at school and at home, confused and angry about the changes he couldn't control. I just want everything to go back to the way it was. Emma sobbed into the phone. I know, sweetheart. I know you do. Change is scary, especially when it's change you didn't choose and can't control. Do you think Mom and Dad will get back together? The question every child of divorce asks, hoping for reassurance that can't be honestly given. I don't know, Emma, but I know that whatever happens, your parents love you and Michael, and they're going to work hard to make sure you both feel safe and cared for, even if your family looks different than it used to. We talked for an hour that night, and Emma called me several more times over the following weeks as she and Michael adjusted to their new reality. I found myself in the strange position of providing emotional support to my grandchildren while having no contact with their father, offering comfort and stability to children whose lives had been destabilized by decisions their parents had made. David never called me directly, but I gathered from Emma's updates that he was struggling with the divorce in ways that surprised her. He'd always seemed so confident and in control, she said, but now he often seemed sad and overwhelmed. He'd had to move into a small apartment because the divorce was expensive. He was working longer hours to manage the financial strain of supporting 2 households. I felt no satisfaction in learning about David's difficulties. Despite everything that had happened between us, I didn't want him to suffer. I wanted him to be happy and successful and fulfilled in his life. I just didn't want him to achieve those things by controlling or diminishing me. As the custody schedule became routine and the initial crisis of the divorce settled into a new normal, Emma's phone calls became less frequent but more reflective. She was maturing quickly, the way children often do when they're forced to confront adult realities earlier than they'd expected. Her questions became more sophisticated, her insights more perceptive. Grandma Marie, she said during one of our conversations, do you think Dad was wrong about the thing that made you guys stop talking? I'd been dreading this question, knowing that Emma was old enough now to want real answers rather than vague reassurances about adult relationships being complicated. I think your father was afraid, I said carefully. Afraid that I might make decisions he disagreed with, or that I might need more help as I got older, or that I might not manage my money in ways he thought were best. Fear makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. But you're not actually confused or anything, are you? I mean, you seem really smart and like you know what you're doing with your life. Thank you for noticing that, sweetheart. No, I'm not confused. I'm doing fine living independently and managing my own affairs. But your father was worried that might change, and he wanted to have legal control over my decisions just in case. And you didn't want him to have that control. I didn't want anyone to have that control. I wanted to keep making my own decisions for as long as I was capable of making them. Emma was quiet for a long moment. I think you were right to want that, she said finally, even if it made everything complicated with the family. Having my teenage granddaughter understand and validate my choices meant more to me than I could have anticipated. Emma was seeing the situation clearly, without the emotional investment and financial motivations that had clouded David's judgment. She was recognizing that I'd been fighting for something important and legitimate, not just being stubborn or difficult. That validation, coming from someone who loved both David and me, helped heal some of the pain I'd been carrying about the family fracture. In September, exactly 2 years after the guardianship hearing, I received a phone call that I'd never expected. David, asking if I would meet him for coffee. I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear from me, he said, his voice sounding older and more tired than I remembered. But I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I'd like to talk to you, if you're willing." I was silent for so long that he asked if I was still there. "I'm here," I said. "I'm just surprised. I understand if you don't want to see me. I understand if you think it's too late for us to fix anything. But Emma keeps telling me that she talks to you, and that you seem happy, and like you're doing well. And I realized I miss knowing how you're doing. I miss having you in my life. Miss having you in my life. Not I miss you, exactly, but something more honest and less sentimental." He missed the relationship we'd had before he'd tried to control me, when he'd felt confident that I would always be available and accommodating and grateful for whatever attention he chose to give me. "Where would you want to meet?" I asked. "Anywhere you're comfortable. Your neighborhood, maybe? That coffee place on 18th Street? Cafe Jumping Bean, where I'd become a regular over the past 2 years, where the baristas knew my order and I'd painted several sketches of the colorful murals on the walls. Neutral territory, but territory where I felt confident and at home. "Saturday afternoon at 2, I said. "I'll be there." I spent the days leading up to that meeting trying to manage my expectations. Was David ready to apologize genuinely for what he'd put me through? Was he hoping to rebuild our relationship on terms that respected my independence and autonomy? Or was this just another attempt to manipulate me, couched in language of reconciliation? I also wondered what I wanted from the meeting. Did I want my son back in my life? The question was more complicated than it would have been 2 years earlier, because the person I was now, more independent, more creative, more confident in my own worth, didn't need David's approval or attention the way the old Marie had. But I missed him. Despite everything, I missed the man he'd been before fear and greed had corrupted our relationship. I missed the possibility of having a son who was also a friend. Saturday afternoon arrived gray and drizzly. One of those early fall days in Chicago when the weather can't decide whether it wants to be summer or winter. I walked to Cafe Jumping Bean, wearing a blue sweater I'd bought for myself in Santa Fe, and the silver earrings that Emma had sent me for my last birthday. David was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee and what looked like a notebook in front of him. He stood up when he saw me, and for a moment we both hesitated, unsure whether to hug or shake hands or simply sit down and begin talking. He looked older, I thought, thinner, with gray at his temples that hadn't been there 2 years ago, and lines around his eyes that suggested he'd been under stress for an extended period. The divorce, Emma had told me, had been difficult both financially and emotionally. "Mom," he said, "thank you for coming. Thank you for calling," I replied, taking the seat across from him. We spent the first few minutes on safe topics, how we were each doing, brief updates on Emma and Michael, the weather. David complimented my sweater and said I looked good, healthier and happier than he'd expected. I told him he looked tired and asked if he was taking care of himself. Then gradually, we began to talk about the things that had brought us to this place. "I've been in therapy," David said, "since the divorce. Jennifer suggested it, and I resisted at first. But then I realized I was making the same kinds of mistakes in my marriage that I'd made in other relationships, including with you." "What kinds of mistakes?" "Trying to control things instead of trusting people, assuming I knew what was best for everyone instead of asking what they actually wanted or needed, making decisions based on fear instead of love." I waited for him to continue. "The guardianship thing," he said, looking down at his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I convinced myself that I was protecting you. But really, I was protecting myself from having to watch you make choices I disagreed with, or from having to deal with the possibility that you might need help in ways that were inconvenient for me." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging that his actions had been motivated by self-interest, rather than concern for my welfare. "I was also afraid you'd spend all your money on things I thought were frivolous, and that there wouldn't be anything left for Emma and Michael's college funds or for emergencies. I thought if I could manage your finances, I could make sure the money was preserved for important things." "What kinds of things did you think I'd spend money on?" "I don't know. Travel, hobbies, things that seemed like luxuries for someone your age." Travel, hobbies, things that seemed like luxuries for someone my age. "David," I said carefully, "do you think that people my age don't deserve to spend their own money on things they enjoy?" He looked uncomfortable. "It's not that you don't deserve it. It's that I thought it would be smarter to save the money for necessities. Whose necessities? A longer pause. I see what you're getting at. Do you? I was thinking about the money as if it was already mine. As if your job was to preserve it for me to inherit, rather than to use it for your own life. Yes, you were. We sat in silence for several minutes, David apparently processing this acknowledgement, and me deciding how much forgiveness I was prepared to offer. I'm sorry, he said finally. I'm sorry for trying to control you, and I'm sorry for the legal stuff, and I'm especially sorry for lying about your competence to try to get what I wanted. You didn't deserve any of that. The apology was more complete and more honest than I'd dared to hope for. But apologies, I'd learned, were just words unless they were accompanied by genuine changes in behavior and attitude. What do you want from me now? I asked. I'd like to try to rebuild our relationship if you're open to that. I'd like Emma and Michael to be able to spend time with you again. I'd like to know what's going on in your life and share what's going on in mine. On what terms? Your terms. Whatever terms make you feel comfortable and respected. I thought about the question I'd learned to ask myself when making decisions about relationships. What did I actually want, independent of what I thought other people expected from me? I wanted to know my grandchildren as they grew up. I wanted them to know me as a real person, not just as a source of birthday cards and holiday gifts. I wanted to share my love of art and books and thoughtful conversation with young people who were smart and curious and still forming their understanding of the world. I also wanted a relationship with David that acknowledged who I'd become rather than trying to reduce me back to who I'd been before I learned to value my own independence. I'd like to try, I said, but I want you to understand that I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago. I have my own life now, my own interests, my own way of spending my time and my money. I'm not going to go back to being available whenever you need something and invisible when you don't. I understand that, and I think that's a good thing, actually. Emma talks about you like you're this interesting, independent woman who does art and travels and has opinions about things. She's proud of you in a way that makes me realize I should have been proud of you too, instead of seeing your independence as a problem. Emma talks about me like I'm an interesting, independent woman. The idea that my granddaughter saw me that way and that her perception had influenced how David thought about me was both gratifying and instructive. I'd spent so much energy over the years trying to make David see me as valuable and interesting, but it was only when I'd stopped trying to impress him and started living for myself that he'd begun to notice who I actually was. How do we do this? I asked. How do we build a relationship after everything that's happened? Slowly, I think. Maybe we start with coffee once in a while, and phone calls that aren't just checking up on each other but actually sharing what's going on in our lives. Maybe you could meet Emma and Michael for lunch sometimes, or they could visit your apartment and see your paintings. I'd like that. And maybe you could tell me about your art and your trip to Santa Fe, and whatever else you're doing that makes you happy. I realized I don't really know what you enjoy or what you're passionate about, and I'd like to learn what I'm passionate about. When was the last time anyone had asked me that question? We talked for another hour, tentatively beginning to bridge the gap that had opened between us. David told me about his new apartment, his therapy sessions, his efforts to be a better co-parent to Emma and Michael. I told him about my painting, my correspondence with Emma, the community of friends I'd developed through my art classes. It felt strange, talking to my son as if we were adults getting to know each other for the first time. But it also felt hopeful in a way our conversations hadn't felt in years. When we were getting ready to leave, David asked one more question. The will, he said. Did you change it? I could have lied or deflected or told him it wasn't his business. Instead, I chose honesty. Yes, I changed it, I said. But David, that decision had nothing to do with punishment or revenge. It had to do with directing my assets toward people and causes that I believed would use them in ways that reflect my values and priorities. He nodded slowly. That makes sense. It's your money, and you should be able to decide what happens to it. If we rebuild our relationship, if I come to believe that you see me as a person rather than as a source of inheritance, I might change it again. But that would be my decision to make, and it wouldn't be a decision I'd make quickly or lightly. I understand. And I want you to know that I hope we can rebuild our relationship regardless of what you decide about the will. I miss having a mother, and I think Emma and Michael miss having a grandmother who's actually part of their lives. I walked home from that coffee meeting feeling cautiously optimistic for the first time in 2 years about the possibility of having some kind of family relationship. Not the old relationship, where I'd subordinated my own needs and interests to everyone else's convenience, but something new and more balanced. Something that recognized that I was a person with my own life, not just a supporting character in other people's stories. Over the following months, David and I began to carefully reconstruct our relationship. We met for coffee every few weeks, and our conversations gradually became more natural and less careful. He started asking me about my paintings and actually listening to my answers. I started sharing stories about my volunteer work and my friendships, and he responded with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance. More importantly, he began including me in family activities again. Not every activity, and not with the assumption that I would automatically be available whenever it was convenient for him, but with advance notice and genuine invitations rather than last-minute obligations. I had dinner at his apartment twice, meeting his new living space and seeing how he was adjusting to single parenthood during his custody weekends. Emma and Michael visited my apartment several times, and I showed them my paintings and taught them basic watercolor techniques. Michael was fascinated by the process of mixing colors and surprised by his own ability to create recognizable shapes and scenes. Emma had inherited some artistic ability and created several pieces that showed real promise. "Grandma Marie," Michael said during one of these visits, "I'm glad you're painting now. Your apartment is much more colorful than it used to be." My apartment is much more colorful than it used to be. He was right, and not just about the physical space. My whole life was more colorful now, more varied, more interesting, more reflective of my own personality and preferences. The relationship with David remained somewhat fragile and tentative, both of us aware of how badly things had gone wrong before, and both committed to not repeating those mistakes. But it was a relationship between adults who respected each other's autonomy, which was something we'd never had before. In the spring, I had my second solo showing at the Logan Square Community Art Gallery, this time featuring work from my Santa Fe trip alongside newer pieces I'd painted around Chicago. Emma and Michael came to the opening, along with David, and I watched my granddaughter study my paintings with the kind of serious attention she usually reserved for her phone. "These are really good, Grandma," she said. "Like, actually good, not just good for someone your age. Actually good, not just good for someone my age." High praise from a teenager who wasn't easily impressed. I sold 6 paintings that night, including the self-portrait I'd painted in Santa Fe. A young couple bought it for their first apartment together, and the woman told me that she'd connected with something in the painting that reminded her of her own grandmother, who'd gone back to school in her 70s to get the degree she'd never had a chance to pursue when she was younger. "You can see the strength in it," the woman said, "the sense of someone who's been through difficult things but hasn't let them defeat her." That night, after the gallery closed and I was walking home through my neighborhood with Emma and Michael on either side of me, Emma asked me a question that surprised me. "Do you think I should try to be an artist when I grow up?" "I think you should try to be whatever makes you feel most alive," I said. "Whether that's art or music or science or teaching or something that doesn't even exist yet. But how do you know what makes you feel most alive? You experiment. You try things that interest you. And you pay attention to which activities make you lose track of time because you're so absorbed in them. You notice which accomplishments make you proud of yourself, not because other people are impressed, but because you know you've done something that expresses who you really are." These were lessons I'd learned late in life, but they were lessons I was grateful to be able to pass on to someone who still had decades ahead of her to apply them. That evening stands out in my memory as one of the happiest I'd experienced in years. Not because it was perfect, few moments in life are, but because it represented something I'd thought I might never have. A family relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation and control. I was 75 years old, and I was finally learning what it felt like to be loved for who I actually was, rather than for my willingness to subordinate myself to other people's preferences. As I write this now, 2 years after that evening, I'm sitting in my living room surrounded by paintings I've created. letters from Emma, who's now away at college studying art and psychology, and photographs from recent trips I've taken to paint in different landscapes. Margaret is coming over for dinner tonight, and tomorrow I'm starting a new advanced painting class. David and I have rebuilt our relationship into something that works for both of us. He no longer sees me as someone to be managed or controlled, and I no longer see him as someone whose approval I need to earn through self-sacrifice. We're adults who happen to be related, who care about each other's well-being and enjoy spending time together, but who each have separate lives and separate priorities. Emma is thriving in college, double majoring in studio art and psychology because she wants to eventually work as an art therapist, helping people process trauma and difficult emotions through creative expression. She calls me regularly, not because she feels obligated to check on her aging grandmother, but because she genuinely enjoys our conversations and values my perspective on her experiences. Michael, now 13 and in middle school, maintains his enthusiasm for learning and his openness to new experiences. He's discovered that he has a talent for creative writing, and he sometimes emails me stories he's written, asking for feedback and suggestions. Last month, he wrote a short story about an elderly woman who discovers she's a talented artist, inspired by what he calls my transformation. My transformation. That's what this has been. Not just surviving the betrayal and loss I experienced, but using those experiences as catalysts for becoming someone I'd never had the opportunity to be before. I've learned that it's possible to love people without allowing them to diminish you. I've learned that family relationships that require you to apologize for your existence aren't worth preserving. I've learned that independence isn't selfishness, and that taking care of your own needs isn't abandoning your responsibilities to others. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, as long as you're willing to disappoint the people who preferred you diminished. If someone listening to this recognizes their own story and mine, if you've ever felt invisible in your own family, or expendable, or like your only value was in what you could provide for other people, I want you to know that change is possible. Not easy, and not without cost, but possible. You don't have to accept being treated as less important than everyone else's comfort. You don't have to pretend that emotional neglect feels like love. You don't have to spend whatever years you have left waiting for other people to decide you're worth their time and attention. You can choose to matter to yourself, even if that choice means other people are disappointed in your refusal to remain small. Have you ever lived through something like this? Have you ever had to choose between maintaining relationships and maintaining your dignity? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story spoke to you, please like this video and subscribe to help me share these conversations with other people who might need to hear them. Sometimes the most important thing we can do for each other is simply acknowledge that we're not alone in our struggles to be seen and valued for who we really are. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to matter, at least for these few minutes, as more than just someone's mother or grandmother or obligation. Thank you for seeing me as Marie Sullivan, artist and individual, woman who refused to disappear quietly into other people's expectations. That recognition means more to me than you'll ever know.